Magnitude of a vector. So what is magnitude of vector? If I said magnitude of any vector, let's say suppose find the magnitude of vector v. So the vectors, let's say the v is the same thing as what? As 2i plus what? Plus 2j plus 3k. So the magnitude of this vector should now be equals to the same thing as square root of what? 2 squared plus what? 2 squared plus what? Plus 3 squared. As you can see, square root of 2 square, which is 4, plus 2 square, which is 4, plus 3 square, which is what? 9. 4 plus 4, which is what? 8, plus what? Plus 9. So all they are in what? All they are in rows. So if I say 8 plus this, what should I going to get? If I said 5 here, 5 here, I'll get what? I'll get 10. I'll have 3. I'll have what? 4. At the end, I'll have 3. I'll have plus 4. At the end, I'll get 17. So therefore, root of 17 is the magnitude of what? Of this vector. So there is one thing that I need you to know. Suppose I'm asked to find the magnitude of vector v. Let's say v1. Let's say vector v1 and what? And v2. So to find the magnitude of this vector is the same thing as saying, let's say x2 minus x1 and y2 minus y1 and what? z3 minus what? Minus z1. So the next thing that I'm going to do is that because this is a vector, so this is now the same thing as saying x2 minus x1 what? I, and therefore what? Plus y2 minus what? y1 j plus what? Plus z3 minus z1 what? K. So at the end, if I am to find the magnitude of what? The magnitude of this vector, this is the same thing as saying the magnitude. This thing that you see, this absolute value, let me say, this that you are seeing, it's indicating what? The magnitude of what? Of vector. So this is the same thing as saying the square root of what? Square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus what? Plus y2 minus y1 squared plus what? Plus z3 minus what? Minus z1 squared. It will give you what? The magnitude of what? Of vector. The main basic idea that I want you to know is that whenever you are asked to find magnitude of vector, it is just the same thing as saying square root of that vectors. As I give example before with 2, and what? And 3. So you are just going to say the magnitude of my vector should now be equal to 2 squared, and therefore 2 squared, and therefore plus what? Plus 3 squared, and find what? Find the answer. So that is what? That is the magnitude of what? Of vector. So let's see some examples. So let's say I'm asked to find. So let's say we are asked to find the length of vector with the point 2, 3, negative 1 terminal, and again with this point 4, negative 1, and what? And 3. So how can we find the length? If we are asked to find the length of what? Of a vector. But you have to notice that the question says length. So you have to take note that if the question says find the length of vector, is the same thing as saying find the magnitude of vector. So because we are given these two vectors, so I have to say I have to find the vector itself. What I mean by the vector itself, the vector that I'm going to take the root of it and what? And find my result. So I have to first say that this is the same thing as the new vector that I'm going to find is the same thing as what? The vector v2 minus what? Minus vector v1. So I have to subtract v2 by v1. So I have to say this should now be equals to, if I said 4 minus what? 4 minus 2, comma, this is for I. For j, I have to say minus 1 minus what? Minus 3, comma, and I have to say 3 minus what? Minus 1, because I have negative sign here. So the v1 of k, which is negative what? 1. So this is the same thing as saying 4 minus 2 is the same thing as what? 2. And minus 1 minus 3 is the same thing as minus 4. And therefore, if I say the 3 minus minus 1 is the same thing as positive 4. So I have to say the unit of what? Sorry, the length of this vector should now be equal to the square root of what? Square root of this. So I will say 2 squared plus what? Plus negative 4 squared plus what? Plus 4 squared. 2 squared is the same thing as what? 4 plus what? 4 squared, which is the same thing as 16, minus 4 squared is the same thing as 16, and also this is the same thing as what? 16 inside what? Inside the root. So I hope you get it. So if I add this, this is the same thing as what? So if I say 16 plus what? Plus 16, this is the same thing as 2. This is the same thing as what? 3, which is 32. And 32 plus what? 32 plus 4. Sorry, I have what? 6. I have 3. So this is the same thing as root of what? Root of 36. And root of 36 is the same thing as what? 6. So therefore, this is all for the first question on how to find the magnitude of a vector. So we are asked to what? We are asked to find the length of the vector with the point this terminal point and what? And also this. So you have to take note that if you are given two vectors to find the magnitude or length, it's the same thing as what? Minus b plus b from what? Minus b. So minus b from a, b minus a is the same thing as negative 3 minus 1, and therefore 4 minus minus 2, and therefore 0 minus what? 5. And this is the same thing as saying minus 3 minus 1 is the same thing as negative 4. 4 minus minus 2 is the same thing as what? Is the same thing as 6. And therefore 0 minus 5 is the same thing as minus 5. So this is the vector that I'm going to take the root of it. So I have to say, let me name it the same thing as what? At this u is the same thing as taking the root of negative what? 4 squared plus what? Plus 6 squared and plus what? Negative 5 what? Negative 5 squared. So therefore this should now be equals to what? Negative 4 squared is the same thing as 16 plus what? If I say 6 squared is the same thing as 36 plus 5 squared is the same thing as what? Is the same thing as 25. So if I say 16 plus this, I will end up with this and this. I'll get 50 plus 1, 60, and then I'll get this 7. Yes, I'll get 77. So the root of what? Root of 77. So what is the square root of 77? If you use the short form or using a calculator, what are you going to get? 8 point what? 8.7. Okay, 8.77. So therefore, this is the final solution to it, to this second question on how to find what? The length of what? Of these two questions. So length is the same thing as magnitude. A question might come, it will give you two vectors and they will say find the length. So don't be confused. It's the same thing as saying find the magnitude of what? Of vectors. So this is all I have for you for the magnitude. Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel.